Okay, I still see people joining, but I think we can start to make sure that we will be on time. First, welcome to this data talk. I should say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending where you are. We'd like to give you a warm welcome to this April additional data talk series titled Data Colonialism, Shaping Data Governance Through African Cultural Realities, organized by the Data Innovation Lab at the German Federal Foreign Office. And we'd like to start with a very special thank you to our speakers for accepting our invitation, and also to the Data Innovation Lab team for their support, Gunda, Branka, David, and Selina, and of course our partner, the GovTech Campus. I'm the Dr. Amandine Nyongenon, and I'm a senior advisor at the Data Innovation Lab. But maybe allow me first to share a few words about the Data Innovation Lab. It's an innovative collaboration established between the German Federal Foreign Office and GovTech Campus in Germany in June 2023. And it serves as a dynamic hub fostering collaboration among diverse stakeholders in Germany and globally. In order to give you an overview, you have a recording of the previous data talk, which is actually available online on YouTube, and you can have a look at it. And just to let you know that the next data talk will be on May, and it will be focused on virtual reality. I have the privilege today to moderate a session with a diverse panel of experts to present, discuss, and analyze how data colonialism operates in Africa. As you know, we have digital technology, and especially those based on artificial intelligence grow in the global south. And there is a call to critically examine and challenge how these technologies might perpetuate patterns of domination. Fully acknowledging the complex and the volatile nature of this topic, data colonialism, the panelists will help us to get a comprehensive understanding and critical perspectives on data colonialism with a focus on Germany and Africa. Just a short reminder for the audience, feel free to make comments and ask questions. And for the speakers, you can, of course, answer the question posted in the chat box during the session. So I would like to talk too much because we have a very busy data talk today. And without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Hans-Christian Mangeldorf for the introductory remark. And Hans-Christian is the Chief Data Scientist at the German Foreign Office. Hans-Christian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Amandine. Guten Morgen, guten Tag, bonjour, bonsoir. Thank you very much, Amandine, for opening this session. Merci beaucoup. Let me also from my end welcome you to this session of our data talk series about data colonialism, a topic that we selected carefully because we thought whenever we are talking about data, technology, artificial intelligence, at the one hand, we should also talk about ethical themes. We should also keep in mind that the use of technology comes with a responsibility. So this is the very first time that we're actually talking about data and colonialism, data colonialism. And we want to add a very small stone, a very small piece to the larger mosaic of Germany's interest and commitment to working on its historical responsibilities, bringing aspects of colonialism back to the table where they belong, and facing our own past, our own history, making sure that we can learn from what happened in the past for a better future. And this overarching idea of coming to terms with a colonial past, also with our colonial past, is one of the driving forces behind this data talk. Overall, my colleagues at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs are very engaged in putting that topic in general on the agenda, so transforming it from a non-issue both in society and in politics, to something that really matters and is being dealt with. So there is a certain responsibility that we as a government fully accept. Germany pursues an individual approach vis-a-vis its colonial history, depending on the on the specific country and the specific context. But I'm not going to go much into that detail, because that would effectively be a different talk, not necessarily a data talk, but still a talk that other colleagues here at the ministry would carry on. Now, very much in line with what we at the Data Innovation Lab, we at the ministry ourselves pursue, we believe in a partnership-based approach. So this is why I'm extremely glad to see such a diverse panel today. And Amandine and team Data Innovation, thank you very much for making this happen. I'm really excited and I'm really looking forward to this session today. Now, as I said in the beginning, data colonialism is something that is a new topic. We consider it extremely exciting, because while we at the ministry are working both on foreign and security policy, working on colonialism, but working especially, and this is my team, working on data, the use of AI, and basically making use of what is out there. We want to hear from as broad an audience as possible about challenges, opportunities, ways to really make use of those exciting technologies that are out there. And I'm extremely glad that we have had in the past, in the very recent past, the opportunity to reach out to various colleagues, including colleagues from Africa, and who will continue to do so with a few events in the pipeline later this year. Now, let me close these short introductory remarks by saying that I'm personally very much committed to learn from other constituencies how they actually make use of data and AI for their purposes, but always keeping in mind that technology is fluid, that this is really something where only a partnership-based approach really makes a difference, where we could extremely well learn from each other. And this is also one of the reasons why we set up the Data Innovation Lab last year, to provide a platform where we could reasonably exchange, be that on technical matters or on ethical matters. And with this, I'll close my short introduction, handing back to Amandine, and I hope I was so efficient to save us a few minutes. Looking forward to the discussion. Amandine, over to you. Merci beaucoup. Let's see what this data talk brings to the table. Very excited. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hans Christian, for these opening remarks. Now we're going to just actually dip into the African perspective, and we're going to start with Aisha. So Aisha, you are currently pursuing your PhD on the topic of digital colonialism, and I think that you may be the best person that understands what data and technology holds this huge potential to foster a more equitable global community. Yet the concept of data colonialism shows how even in the absence of traditional colonial structures, we still have imbalance of power. And this imbalance of power continue to shape and widen inequalities and in digital interaction. Data colonialism is not just about data, contrary on what we expect. It really involves complex social, political, and historical issues. So I would like to ask you the question, could you please enlighten us on how you would define data colonialism? And how can we rethink data governance in Africa in light of the current digital context? So Aisha, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much, Amandine, for the introduction and the invitation to speak today. So I think first, to answer your question, your two questions, I think first it makes sense to talk briefly about the different ways that the current digital reality that we're living in has been described as colonial. And after that, I can talk about what connects these different approaches, and then also what role Africa plays in them and the African continent. So to start, there are several different terms floating around when we talk about data colonialism. There is data colonialism, there is the term of algorithmic colonization, there's digital colonialism, techno-colonialism, so all of these different terms. And the arguments that are made in the usage of these terms, they're very varied, and they point towards different directions. So first, they point towards the way that the digital economy, or more specifically digital capitalism, relies on the extraction of data and the appropriation of the social relations that underlie these data. For most of us, our lives are increasingly transformed into data, whether it is the amount of steps we take, which is recorded by a Fitbit, or whether it is the capturing of where we go through locational data, or whether it is the data that is captured through our interaction on social media and what we like on social media. So these data of us and our social lives then become part of an economic system which profits of us and our social lives. For example, through advertisement profits or through data brokerage. So in other words, this first concept of data colonialism is really about that something fundamentally human and fundamentally social is being extracted, and that this extraction amounts to a new form of colonialism. And a second direction, a second interpretation of the term is the role, or is concerned with the role of big technology companies in the global South and Africa, and particularly from the United States, from China, but also from the European Union, the European region. So here, one main concern is the quasi-monopoly power over digital infrastructure. And another concern is also the use of technology to solve social problems, where both the problem and the solution are defined from the outside, more specifically the global north, or where these technology conglomerates are originating. And where also the solutions to these social problems, this technology solutions to social problems, really mostly serve corporate interests. And as you might see and recognize, the second direction of the term data colonialism or digital colonialism is not entirely separate from the first direction that I've outlined, but the extraction of our social life and interaction. Because a technological or algorithmic solution to a social problem also means more data that can then in turn be extracted for commercial purposes. And finally, as a third direction, it is important to look towards a criticism that is formulated by data colonialism that points towards the ways that historical forms of colonialism shaped the current world that we live in. So one example could be the use of non-digital surveillance systems that were pioneered during colonialism. For instance, population registries or censuses. So the question here is, what is the legacy of these ways to categorize the population in today's digital surveillance systems? And what role does the political economy play in these digital surveillance systems? But another example could also be borders, where there are certain vulnerabilities that are created. So here, the term of data colonialism can make us question who is made vulnerable at these borders. For instance, whose biometric data is captured and who has the option to give meaningful consent to this capturing of data. So whether it's a European border or an Israeli checkpoint in the West Bank, it is then incredibly important to ask what the power relations are when these data are captured and databases are created. Another example of this, the way that there's a continuity of historical colonialism in digital systems is the self-determined access to data of communities that were impacted by historical colonialism. For example, in the case of Aboriginal communities in Australia, in New Zealand, in Canada, indigenous communities in Canada. So the questions here are, how do digital technologies and algorithmic systems worsen already existing inequalities? And in what ways do they create new ones? And as you can see, to sum up this up, as you can see, there are several different ways to approach the topic of digital colonialism. And I'm mentioning all of these different approaches not to make it overly complicated, but really to stress the point that it is important not to take the term colonialism too lightly, but to really think about what it implies to say and to say that there is something colonial today and to talk about data colonialism. I would say what unites all of these different formulations, these three categorizations that I gave, is really that there is an idea that there is something colonial today, either as a new form of colonialism, as in the first example, where our social data and our social human life is extracted, but also that there is a continuation of historical colonialism or a mixture of both. And what we might also see in this formulation is that Africa has an interesting role because data colonialism and digital colonialism is not confined to Africa. I would say that historical colonialism changed the world in many different places. We live in structures that were shaped by colonialism, and yet, arguably, Africa plays a specific role. And for this, for example, we only have to look at the way that Africa has been presented as this new frontier of untapped data potential to be captured by the digital economy. So to answer your second question about how data colonialism and these concepts of data colonialism should make us think about African data governance, I would say it really depends on how one defines data colonialism. For example, whether the focus is primarily on regulating business models, or, for example, the problem of exclusion in digital identity systems. And I would say that, I personally would say that each of these approaches I've outlined before is valuable. They work together, but they definitely determine the priority that is given in different policies. But I think all of these should be taken into account when thinking about data governance in Africa. But to sum it up, I would say that there are two areas which are very important to talk about. One is regulation and the power of regulation to make our digitally mediated lives more just and equitable. Data protection and privacy laws are one area, but there are also other ones. And then the second element is really to evaluate what kind of values are underlying technology development and what kind of values are guiding technology use as well, and who has a seat at the table. So we should ask, who is technology serving and who benefits from it?
Thank you, Aisha. Thank you very much for this. You really set the stage, I would say. I mean, it was definitely not more complex. I mean, your free direction, the way you explaining it was really clear, and I think that's you also maybe underline a key point, this question of regulation, which is particularly important. And we talk a little bit about it during the first data talk around Africa on data sovereignty. Now, and you mentioned also this is the question of the geopolitical context, the actors of data colonialism. I would like to now ask Bazo to say a word about it. Bazo, you are an associate professor of politics and international relations at the University of Johannesburg, South Africa, where you actually leads one of very interesting units. It's about digital policy research. And I would like to mention that you also co-author a book on artificial intelligence and emerging technology in international relations. And maybe I can also add that you published this also very, I think for me, that's a really flagship report on what is Africa's digital agenda in the Africa Policy Research Institute. And I really encourage the people who need to better understand what is the Africa agenda, digital agenda, to read this one, because it's really clear and very, very insightful. But just to go back to the question I have for you, the term data colonialism actually reflects ongoing issue of colonial power dynamics. So I would like to ask you, would you categorize Europe, the USA, the US, or China as new digital colonial powers? How do you think the investment of tech giants like Alphabet, Google, Amazon, Apple, Meta, or Microsoft contribute to the power imbalance in Africa? Bazo, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amandine, for that question, really two-part question. So it's quite interesting, right? I mean, I'm in a country in Africa, South Africa, which would be seen by our neighbors and a lot of other countries on the continent to be somewhat colonial itself, right? So I find these categories to be really interesting. And although South Africa does try, including our own tech companies, do try to be sensitive to local environments, to local realities in different countries, they don't always succeed. And this also includes some of the state-owned companies. So there's always that imbalance. So to the question of whether the major powers that you've mentioned are colonial, I would say it really doesn't matter the intent, but the outcome repeats what Africa recognizes to have been colonial, because there is this reference point that unites almost all 54, 55 countries, depending on how you count, that unites them in terms of their colonial experience, including, by the way, Ethiopia, which gets a reputation for not having been colonized, but there is the Eritrean kind of exception there. So I think it really doesn't matter what the intent is. What matters is whether you play into the pre-existing legacies which have rendered Africa an asymmetrical player. And in that relationship, tending to be on the weaker side on most questions, militarily, economically. And then you bring in this dimension of data as well, which I think further gives the countries you've mentioned further advantage, because you have to consider they not only have more power militarily and economically than Africa. In some respects, they also know Africa better than African leaders know their own countries because of this data question, because of the traffic of the data. It is the case that individual countries trade both in terms of physical goods and services, but also in digital data. Most of the traffic is outward. And I was looking at a somewhat outdated chart by the McKinsey group, actually. And there you see that the continent, so it tracks how much data moves, how many gigabits per second move between each region. And here you see that there are about 24,000 gigabits per second between the US and Europe, and then about 20,000 gigabits between US and Asia, as well as US and Latin America. But almost with everyone else, Africa is at about 1,000 gigabits per second. So you're comparing here 20,000 and 25,000 versus 1,000 gigabits per second. But with Europe is the exception, there's about 5,000 gigabits per second. So clearly most of our traffic is towards Europe. And may also have to do with the fact that, some US companies move their data centers to Europe that then service Africa and the Middle East. But it's a reality nonetheless. And so there's a great deal of knowledge about Africa. And of course, knowledge is power. It's cliche, but it's true. And even if you move then to things like agriculture and the mineral sector, always when there's exploration, the expertise that will be brought in will be European, because they've more sophisticated data acquiring infrastructure, frankly, because to explore what oil there is, oil fields there are, that's an indicator of how much data acquisition and procurement abilities you have. So then moving to so that's the countries. And China also is quite an interesting one here, because it brings in, I think, some lessons. So I think it also tends to play into the same patterns, but in a different way, in a very different way in some respects. Where China has thrived, for example, is in the e-commerce. And that's where the Americans, for example, have not been able to break in. So online retail, Amazon dominates almost everywhere else except in Africa. And that also goes to the data issue, because Amazon works best when there's street addresses, everything is neatly laid out. But on the African ground, that's not always the case, right? There isn't this first street, second street, and so on. So I think that's China. It also, of course, competes, and in some cases has won when you compare with for example, you certain U.S. companies, certainly on the hardware side. Then the companies, right? I think here I'm a bit more sympathetic, and I know I shouldn't be. I'm sympathetic because a company's first responsibility is to self-enrich, and so that the shareholders get their money's worth. And I'm sympathetic for a second reason, which is that they do not do anything unique in Africa, which they don't do in the US, especially here. I'm thinking of the big tech companies. They are exploitative wherever they are. And they don't allow, for example, unionization, workers to form unions in the US. Amazon famously exploitative with regards to how they treat their workers in their warehouses, and massive layoffs, for example. So there's nothing unique about their bad behavior, let me say, on the African continent. And of course, ironically, Google's founding motto was that do no evil, right? But what's been interesting and encouraging is the pushback by the European Union, which I think there's a lot to be learned from by the African side in terms of the anti-competition practices of these companies that's been pushed back against by the European Union. And I must then conclude also by pointing to the fact that there's been some missed opportunities by the African side. And I always try to pay attention to not only what is the outside world doing to exploit Africa, but what are some of the missed opportunities or opportunities that the continent has missed or can still seize? Because I think ultimately it's a question of agency. And I don't find it compelling when all of Africa's problems, including in this digital arena, are pinned on the outside world. And so I think there have been missed opportunities when it comes to in policy terms, when it comes to R&D, when it comes to research and development. I think that then expresses itself in the form of the brain drain, because the irony is a lot of the brain behind these companies stems from Africa. It's people who have not found a supportive ecosystem within the continent, who've then had to migrate. And ironically, then their brain power is indeed fueling these companies that then come and have uncompetitive and unfriendly practices on the continent. And I was looking at an interesting statistic, which we share in the book you mentioned earlier, Amandine, which is that in as much as the continent forms about 18% of the global population, only 3% of GitHub projects are on the continent, are by creators, coders on the continent. Now that's quite problematic, because it tells me that not enough is being done to nurture and keep talent on the African continent itself. And it's not everything, but I think it's a great proxy of how much organic development is going on in a domain or in a jurisdiction. And so I would point to those missed research and development opportunities. But I would say then and I think this conversation will also look towards solutions, but I think the pushback, the assertion of sovereignty that we've seen from Europe, but increasingly also from countries on the continent, right? From the likes of Rwanda, even the likes of South Africa, in terms of pushing legislation that requires these companies, when they want to invest, to have mutually beneficial practices, including hiring, for example, people and sharing infrastructure, so that there's social beneficiation from their presence on the continent. So I'll stop there for now. Thank you very much, Emily.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Baso. I think it was interesting just to put into perspective maybe two reality that's from the South African borders country. South Africa actually is also a colonial country, and that's interesting. And also to say that there is nothing unique in the way some external company actually behave in Africa, and they are doing the same all around the world. So yeah, I think it's also important just to put the reality in Africa into perspective with what's going on in the continent and outside. I would like now to give the floor to Joshua Kwesi Ekins. Joshua, you are political scientist, human rights activist at ZLA, and a PhD candidate at University of Kassel Department of Development and Post-Colonial Studies. And so you publish also for the Africa Policy Research Institute a very interesting paper around data extractivism and digital self-determination. So you also contribute your better knowledge of the topic. And we know definitely that we still need to have this deeper knowledge around artificial intelligence, digital technology, and how they expand in the global south. I would like to ask you a couple of questions. The first one is, how should we interpret the concept of decolonization in the digital context? Moving beyond a state-centric focus, because we talk a lot about sovereignty, but I think could you also discuss the idea of African agency within the digital agenda? And maybe my last question would be, what are the implications of data colonialism for society and community in Africa? Again, to maybe decentralize this state focus we usually have. Joshua, the floor is yours.
Thanks
You're
for
mute.
all the colleagues. I'm muted. Oh, no.
Yeah, that's okay. No, it's good.
Let me unmute myself. Okay, I'm unmuted now. Right. Yeah, thank you, Amandine, for the invitation, and thanks for the opportunity to be part of this panel, and thanks to all the colleagues who have spoken before. I would really like to answer the first question, how should we interpret the concept of decolonization in this context? By really following Aisha's call, right? So I think we should not take these terms lightly. Colonialism, decolonization, right? I'd like to offer a pair of terms as tools to really move beyond using, especially decolonization, as a trendy buzzword, right? I think we should look at the key terms of coloniality and decoloniality in the context of data colonialism. As has been said before, right, when we talk of data colonialism, it's actually the colonialism, not necessarily the data, that is the problem. Of course, yes, data and the digital more broadly, they also have some specific features and specific coloniality, right, and we'll get to that. But I think it's important to first be clear about colonialism and decolonization, right? So it's important to recognize that the idea of decolonization is, of course, far broader than what has been achieved with so-called flag independence. And Basso has mentioned, the continuities of colonial hierarchies. And I would say, of course, South Africa is a specific case, but these dynamics, of course, extend far beyond its borders, right? And the reason why people such as Nkrumah and many others have warned that juridical independence is mostly nominal and does not really, and certainly not automatically, lead to actual sovereignty, that's simply the fact that there are many colonial continuities manifesting in power imbalances in the economic sphere, but also in international politics, and in the way these two intersect in what is, I would say, euphemistically called development cooperation, right? And yes, of course, there's a term, neocolonialism, to describe some of this continued influence, but I would say that coloniality is a bit broader and is something that creates opportunity structures that also then, as we have already heard, structure the very way in which technologies, but also access to data and the shaping of data as a resource is itself then structured, right? And that's also the reason why, this pervasive structuring is also the reason why we can't just flip a digital justice switch, right, and have an immediate, solution to these hierarchies, because these hierarchies actually predate the digital, but have, of course, shaped it in ways that create a lopsided playing field. And so I think in recognizing this, we should endeavor to look at and maybe also speak more of the coloniality of data and coloniality of the digital, meaning that the way they are shaped today cannot be understood without these opportunity structures and hierarchies, right, that are colonial in origin, and that therefore also carry many hierarchies, Eurocentric ones, and also, of course, structurally racist hierarchies, right? And especially the latter ones, in my mind, they're still too seldomly talked about in such policy fora, but they have become painfully obvious in the reality of entrenched AI biases, for example, right? So if we then conceive of this idea of coloniality as, the deeply entrenched flip side of modernity of, the current, state that we're living in, it also means that the current division of labor and power imbalances of international relations and so on are beset by these continuities that also compound, right? And yes, as they compound, they're also normalized, they're made invisible, or they're rationalized, right? It's just the way the world is. And they're partly abstracted away from view, especially also through digital communication and data-based tools, for example, for what I would say is often just-in-time exploitation, right? For example, through algorithmically assisted automation of international supply chains and other extractive efficiencies. So I would say that, these realities of neocolonialism and the coloniality of data structure technology, they structure our interactions with it, but this structural violence often remains hidden. Just a few quick examples. I think we're all familiar with the ways in which conflict in the Eastern Congo for decades has been inextricably linked to resource extraction from there, that itself is a key aspect of the ongoing digitalization, digital revolution, because simply, the hardware that we're all using, including to make this call right now, would be unthinkable without this access, right? Another very recent example would be advances in AI development, which would be inconceivable without huge amounts of manual labor, specifically also on the African continent and in other parts of the former decolonized world, right? And you might be familiar with, the recent outcry when Kenyan workers have revealed the ways in which they have been made to work under appalling conditions to label data of extreme violence and depravity to make sure that such violence is then not regurgitated, for example, by ChatGPT, right? OpenAI was one of the companies that contracted them. So both cases, in my mind, illustrate that coloniality creates these opportunity structures for continued exploitation, right? And that means, dismantling or even just reducing this would actually require an engagement with these the deeper structures and the way in which the opportunity structures compound based on layers of history and interlocking hierarchies today, right? I will, skip another example to just say that in my mind, the corresponding term then, decoloniality, is also one that requires a deeper engagement, where the idea is that encountering this colonial present, we need to acknowledge the historical roots and the compounding effects, which means we must also acknowledge that there can be no quick and certainly no quick fix tech-based solution to these issues. So both of these terms call us not into, usage as buzzwords, but into an actual deeper engagement with these complexities, right? Yes, there are overarching patterns that we can identify, but it also means that if we take these terms and these histories seriously, we also need to look at the specificity of data coloniality and data decoloniality, African resistive agency, in specific contexts, in specific fields, and they all, require this more in-depth investigation rather than quick labeling, right? So to wrap up, what are the implications, right, of such colonialism? I think I've sketched this already, but since we've also spoken of AI and newer developments, I just want to pick out the fact that the lopsided playing field also means that some of the potential benefits and some of the usages that could be potentially particularly helpful in many African contexts, for example, AI assistance in education, including indigenous language-based education, cannot accrue due to what Basu also described in terms of, the ways in which Western perspectives are also often hard-coded, literally, into some of these tools, even though they're also based on extractive labor, as I've described earlier. Now, moving beyond a state-centric focus, right? Of course, it's important to note that, yes, there are, civil society organizations, there are startups, there are very, very important agents in different African contexts trying to push against the dynamics that I have just described. And in the policy space, yes, we can critique national governments. I think it's also important to apply the lens of coloniality to that, so, just as in history, we also have to ask who actually benefits from dragging their feet, and what about, also African interests that align, right, with continued extraction. So I would end by saying there's a lopsided playing field, and it's important to not just recognize the resistive agency, but also engage with more sustained analysis that can identify the structural roadblocks that hinder, these many creative and often ingenious agents from really pushing in a different direction.
Thank you very much, Joshua, and thank you for, Aisha actually help us to better understand this question of decolonization, and especially the word you use, coloniality and decoloniality. I think it's important just to understand that something sometimes is very subtle, but the nuances are very important, and also to give us a very concrete example of exactly to illustrate that there is no quick fix solution, as you said, that it's important to have in mind the context, the specificity, and definitely it gives the, now we need to know more about all this context and specificity, obviously, and to have again more example, especially when you said that beyond the state-centric focus, we need to know more about what the communities, what the civil society are doing. And now what we can do actually is definitely to have a deeper understanding of the role of community with Victor, especially to have a better understanding of how actually big data not only brings attention to community, often overlook, they also raise obviously concern around about local data ownership, sovereignty, and governance. But we know that in this context, again, beyond the state-centric focus, there is this pressing need for a more inclusive approach that respects the diverse perspective acknowledged on all communities. Aisha also mentioned, this idea of indigenous, and it's not specific to Africa, but that's also very important. So Victor, in your role as a head of program at Kiktanet, could you just explain how Kiktanet contributes to digital inclusion? And could you maybe provide a concrete example of how community networks help to bridge the digital divide? And my last question will be, how can actors like the German Federal Foreign Office paved the way for a digital future that is truly inclusive. I think it's also important to help some governments, and especially in Europe, to better understand how they can actually change the way they actually work at the moment, the way they interact with this community at the local level. So, Victor, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to have these discussions with everybody. So maybe just to introduce, Kiktanet is a non-profit think tank which works out of Nairobi. And we work to basically catalyze ICT reforms through stakeholder engagement. So our primary ways or means of working are through promoting stakeholder engagement, research, policy, advocacy, and capacity building. In terms of what has been Kiktanet's contribution to inclusion, digital inclusion, I think we have done a number of things which have contributed to promoting digital inclusion in Kenya. The first approach that we normally promote is to have, multi-stakeholder engagement. We believe that when stakeholders engage, then all the perspectives can be heard, and we therefore continue to call for, greater multi-stakeholder participation, whether it is in meetings or in processes, because we believe that everybody has a say or has a view, and those views are important and should be considered in the decision-making and policy-making processes. Secondly, in the policy and legal space, we have been working to contribute to various laws and policies. This is to make sure that, the legal framework or the policy framework also supports inclusion, making sure that the voices of all relevant stakeholders are actually heard. And we have, for example, we helped develop a legal framework for the licensing of community networks in Kenya, and this has enabled people from different communities to set up their own networks across the country. And as a result, we have more people from underserved areas accessing the internet, which is positive. And there's also a licensing framework that is very different from what is used to license telcos and ISPs, which then means that communities that are not covered by these ISPs can still develop their own networks and connect to the internet. The other aspect is, capacity building. We have developed a number of trainings, course content on various digital literacy programs, which target marginalized groups. This has been an area such as cyber hygiene, because one of the things we realize is that many people from poor communities or underserved areas really don't have a good understanding of the digital ecosystem, and therefore are often vulnerable to cyber attacks or even cyber fraud, which is quite rampant in Kenya. So developing these programs in simplified, in simple, contextually relevant, content that, ordinary people, even people who are illiterate, can understand, because we use skits where you can just see and listen and pass the information that is relevant for people who are either illiterate or don't have a lot of time. So we're trying to compress the messages to also enable people to get very quickly messages that can be sent on WhatsApp or videos, short videos that can be shared through various platforms, so that then the idea is to help people get the message about, simple things such as how to keep a strong password, for example. We've also developed other programs around, gender-based violence, because we also realize that women, persons with disabilities, continuously face attacks, and these are areas that we've tried to cover through our curriculum. But over and above that, we also have a course which we implement every year called the Kenya School of Internet Governance. This was informed by the need to have more voices in policy making, because as we are talking now, we realize that not every person has capacity and skill and understanding of internet governance or policy issues. So the idea behind the course is to introduce various stakeholders to the policy discussion, so they can understand and be able to engage more effectively and from an informed position. And the other intervention that we've undertaken is to carry out research. For example, last year we reviewed 100 government websites to check how accessible they are for persons with disabilities. And we realized that more than 60% of those websites were not accessible for persons with disabilities. Yet the government, for example, is transitioning and digitizing all its services online. So the goal was just to show that, while we might be digitizing, we may also be leaving a number of people behind, even when we are saying that ICTs are bridging that divide. So that's something that we felt was important to do. We've also tried to make sure to advocate for better policies for persons with disabilities and ensure that they are included in various processes. We've also mapped Kenya's access ecosystem, and we've produced a number of reports just highlighting the connectivity gaps that we have in the country, and made a number of recommendations on the areas that need reform, including contributions to the improvement of the universal use of universal service funds, which should be directed at increasing connectivity to rural and underserved areas. The other aspect that you asked about was on community networks. I know I've mentioned, but it's not very well understood. But maybe just to put it simply, it's just that these are small ISPs that, or internet service providers for that matter, that are established by communities in rural areas or in areas which are underserved, meaning that where major telecom networks or internet service providers do not provide services in rural and remote areas, then the communities can set up small networks to provide internet at a very low cost, or sometimes free, or sometimes with value addition, such as by providing information portals where locals can be able to access internet and various internet services within their communities. The beauty of community networks is that it addresses some of the big barriers that we have to digital access. One is the affordability question, because then find that internet access will be fairly cheap and affordable, and it will also be available and within at the community level. Secondly, they are run and operated by people who are from the same community, so we have a strong sense of ownership, and they're able to provide contextually relevant information and also start onboarding the local communities to internet access. So whether they're in rural areas or in urban slums, which are usually not catered for, or for people who are in those low-income areas, they're able to engage with locally relevant content. The other aspect is that where, for example, we have set up, because KickTernet has a community network in Mathare slums, which is one of the second largest slums in Nairobi. We also provide digital literacy training, and this ensures that, as we're telling people that, there is internet, you're also helping them build their own capacity to understand how the internet works, learn basic computer skills, have online safety skills in terms of cyber hygiene practices, and also learn how to put their businesses online and also access government services. So we have been able to see that through these initiatives, when people are connected to the internet, they're able to expand their communication, they're able to engage with, news that is happening within and around them, and also put their businesses online and also trade, which is also good for the country. And I think with respect to the last aspect, I think in terms of how do we pave our way to a digital future that is inclusive, I think it is important to do, well, I'll just say maybe 3 big things. One is we need to expand, the internet or ICT infrastructure to ensure that coverage is accessible for everybody, including those in remote, marginalized areas, because if we are moving digital, then it's important that we are not leaving other people behind. Secondly, is that we need to work to promote media and information literacy, or even digital literacy. We realize that we are not at the same levels, and therefore one of the ways of bridging the digital divide is to address the skills gap. And therefore, if we're able to promote awareness and also digital upskilling, we'll be able to bridge that gap. And this can be through trainings and various programs. Lastly, is that we need to promote multi-stakeholder engagement. I think the problem of the digital divide affects everybody, and everybody can have a role. But we all work in different ways. There are roles for government, there are roles for civil society, there are roles for private sector, there are roles for development organizations. But you sort of find that sometimes in our countries, these groups are working at cross purposes and do not collaborate. Therefore, if we're able to create those synergies where the various stakeholders and their various capacities can collaborate to address this common problem, I think we'll make good progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor, for this very concrete presentation of what Kiktanet is doing, and also for providing us a very concrete recommendation on how to make sure that we can actually include community, and also this idea to promote this multi-stakeholders engagement. I would like now to see how Caleb can actually jump in this discussion. Caleb, you are the Africa lead at Build Up, where you manage programs related to digital conflict, information ecosystem, and depolarization of projects across Africa. And we know that given the persistent risk that imbalances of power could continue to shape and widen inequality in digital interaction, this idea of decolonization advocate for equitable use of technology. And the idea is really to ensure that these tools serve everyone fairly, as Victor mentioned, and reflects diverse perspective rather than predominantly non-Africa viewpoints. So I would like to ask you the following question from a more positive perspective and based on your experience. Could you share concrete examples of how technology can be used to avoid the trap of data colonialism, and how can external actors better incorporate the insight of local users and citizens into their work? So Caleb, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And it is a pleasure to be here and joining this conversation. And I also just want to, before just diving into that point, I want to connect it to what Victor just shared and talk about this issue of digital divide and how then it can easily be used to put communities and countries into a trap of data colonialism. So one of the things we've seen in the recent past is this idea of altruism, right? Where technology companies take advantage of untapped data resources under the shadow of bridging the digital divide. And then through the pretense of altruism, they're able to roll out technologies that then push governments or states to connect their communities. So if you think about Facebook Basics, for instance, a technology solution that was ideally rolled out to connect communities. However, what you end up doing is, yes, you get internet connectivity in your communities, but then the population ends up thinking that Facebook is the internet. And when Facebook goes down, the whole sort of network in those communities, sort of social, economic, financial, everything just crumbles because they don't know an alternative. And everything that they build then is built on this foundation, which is a technology company, and everything then is seen through that lens of that technology company. So I just want to point out that in itself can easily be a way to push back using that technology solution as a way to bridge the digital divide, to look at what are these solutions that are being introduced in the rush to bridging this divide, and how do they either promote data colonialism, or do they actually provide a free and fair use of the internet? So by understanding those technologies, we're able now to basically push back on some of these processes. And for instance, India did it when this was being rolled out, I think it was 2015, but most of the African countries actually adopted it. And yet there's still other solutions, tech solutions like this, that are still being rolled out, because the whole idea is to then tap on these data resources that are not yet connected. So that is just one point to say, that as we're rushing towards digital divide, also look at the technology itself and say, well, is it connecting or is it just extracting, or both? And now to your point, I think this issue of data colonialism is multifactorial in many ways, and it requires a type of system thinking, so that where you have room for policy, but also room for local actors to be able to work in that ecosystem that is created by policy. Otherwise, you might find sometimes that there is push on the local actors or local tech solutions, but then the policies themselves do not create an environment for that. So it kind of becomes very challenging to work even in societies where that colonialism is taking place. So I'll give a few examples just on this, so that based on the work that we're doing, so we can see what some of the solutions look like. So one of the approaches we are thinking at Build Up, where I do work, is on collaborative development of technologies and processes. So there is this process called automatic classifiers for peace, right? So it's basically a process and an open source community of researchers and organizations who are interested in aiding social media analysis through automatic classification of social media discourse, to be able to understand what are Africans saying in relation to their realities, or how do they address harmful content. So for instance, when you think about polarization, hate speech, mis and disinformation, and dangerous speech becomes really key in understanding how polarization happens in different communities. But there is really no data to analyze that. And every time you go to the big tech companies, companies that hold this data to be able to understand some of these harms, it becomes very problematic. So automatic classifiers for peace then looks at organizations that are trying to address these harms and says, how can we work with you to understand the discourse that is actually causing division in your communities? And this brings in techies who are able to build their own models, as opposed to depending on Western models, and saying, okay, we're going to build these models together with the communities that are looking at this data in their own lens. So for instance, we did this in Nigeria, and we were able to develop a data set that actually maps out hate speech and dangerous speech. And communities are able now to classify that data using their own realities, as opposed to using a reality that the West says that this is hate speech and this is not, but what the communities actually see that can catalyze violence. So being able to create that data set that is owned by the community and is done through an open source process that people can actually see and interrogate this process, then you start to look at how technology in itself can start to decolonize, or to move us away from this colonial trap of always depending on a Western entity or another outside entity that would come in and solve our problems. Another example is Be My Eyes, which is a global community that connects people who are blind and who have low vision, and sighted volunteers to be able to work together to understand what they're actually engaging with in their content, to assist them with daily tasks, from choosing a piece of clothing to a particular color, or overlabeled so that they don't harm themselves if they're taking content with their food. Like for instance, like a bottle that has label and you're not sure what that label is. So being able to make that technology accessible, not just to a particular community in a country, but also a niche within that community that is visually impaired, and being able to say, okay, can you have access to this technology? Another example is Mozilla Native, that allows people who speak indigenous languages to be able to play a role in translating digital content within the browser that users are using. So Mozilla Natives allows you to go in, put in some time. So if you think about how Wikipedia used to work, so put in some time using your own understanding of the indigenous language and be able to develop content that other people who do not necessarily speak English or just one of these major languages all across the world can actually come in and consume that content. So that connects also to another solution in technology on addressing language gaps, because if you think about the way we consume tech, if there are community guidelines that you're supposed to understand to either protect your privacy, if they're written in a different language, then by default you are at a disadvantage. So this is more not a solution, but of a process that we were part of. So in 2017. One of the tech companies was in Kenya to look at the elections to try and see how they can provide better services to address polarization. But one of the key things we were pointing out was in the community guidelines, they didn't have the content translated to Somali or Amharic. Yet Somali is a whole country and Ethiopia is another whole country. And yet they were saying they were trying to be inclusive. So they later changed it and updated their content, right? And through putting pressure on saying, look, we cannot look at violent extremist content and be able to navigate those harms if people who are supposed to look at the community guidelines and know that they have the ability to report harmful content on their platforms, they don't have that access because they don't understand the community guidelines because they're written in a different language. So being able to see how language then can be implemented into these technologies that we're already using so that people can now can take full agency of how they use them. Otherwise, you just are used and you cannot navigate effectively within these technologies. So for instance, TikTok doesn't have Amharic translation in its community guidelines. So the question is, what happens in Ethiopia if this content is harmful and I want to report it, or I just want to understand how best this platform is using my data and to determine whether I'm going to continue using it or not, yet I cannot understand the language that is actually being put out there. And then one of the other things also we've seen or we've been doing as build-up is on participatory data processes. So these are participatory methods to produce, analyze, and share quantitative and qualitative data around conflict, because we are a peace-building organization. And this is where public is engaged from the conception of the questionnaires to the implementations of the survey, to the data analysis, and also to the data visualization that produces a tool that then can be used by that community to hold governments accountable or to have conversations with governments. So what you're basically doing is you're not only producing new data with the communities, but you're also building this capacity for within that community to understand how to manage data-related processes, what is considered extractive, so that when they see those patterns in other contexts, they're able to point it out and say, no, we've gone through this process and we know it's not supposed to be working like this. So this is at a small level. We've done it in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Guinea-Bissau, and Puntland in Somalia, and also in Sudan. And if you think about these are areas where conflict is, they have issues with conflict and ongoing wars. But then the whole point around this pockets of these processes is to think about how do we get this type of process at the National Statistical Office, where if you want to run a participatory data process, you're not doing it at a small scale, but you're also doing it at a countrywide scale, at a regional level, where communities are actually engaged in the process of how this data is developed, as opposed to an external entity. And then lastly, what you're seeing across the region in Africa is this idea of decentralizing the reliance of data industries. So where you don't have to go to OpenAI or any other tech companies to get an updated version of ChatGPT with African languages. So for instance, Maskani, which is a grassroots organization whose mission is to strengthen the research on natural language processing language with African languages. So not only think about languages that exist already, but also the indigenous languages, or Deep Learning Indaba, which is African machine learning community in Africa to strengthen the research in that particular space, as opposed to saying, okay, we have to go to conference in San Francisco to learn about this, but also being able to build it at home and see what other African researchers are doing and how they're addressing all these issues with that affected to language. But there's one thing I just want to mention about solutions like this. Some of them depend on external funding. And as we all know, and I don't want to move away from this conversation, we're not talking about aid or funding, because it affects a lot of what the technologies local actors are going to build. So for instance, funding for development is usually determined by an external actor who usually shapes the work that is done and the data that is gathered. So when a funder says we're only going to fund this particular technology or this particular build of this issue, and the question is who's setting the agenda, right? Is it the National Statistical Organization offices within a country? Is it the locals who are developing, who are saying these are the major issues, so we're going to build technologies that address these issues? Or is it somebody who is seated outside saying, we want to learn about youth and technology, so we want to see which organizations are going to work on that, and basically dangling the funding just so that that solution can be built. So I just want to stop there because I think that covers a bit of what we're seeing across the region.
Thank you very much, Caleb. I think the point you made at the end is particularly relevant, the question of how the connection with the external funding, and it also raised the question which was mentioned before, how we can better align the African agenda, obviously at the state level, but also at the local level, with the agenda of external actors. And as you said, if they are shaping the agenda, it's how we can make sure that it covers and meets the expectations at the local level. And especially, also Victor mentioned some of these issues, the question of capacity building, the question of ICT, of infrastructure. They are still key question when we talk about data, and we know that especially for most of these projects, Africa needs external funding. So I thank you for just put this into perspective, but I think it's also very important. The question around the language gap was also very interesting, I think, and the example you give with TikTok, especially on the idea of harmful content. I think it's also key to understand it, and maybe let's see if we have enough time, if you can elaborate a little bit during the Q&A. And I also found interesting the what you are doing at Build Up around the participatory process, and especially if you are working in a conflicts context. It actually had another layer of complexity to this, to the way you need to handle this issue of data and also data colonialism more broadly. So we still have, let's say, 15 minutes for the Q&A session. I saw a few questions on the chats. I don't know if Bazo and Aisha, did you have the opportunity to have a look at it? Okay. Okay, so that's good. So the first question, just for the audience, I have for Bazo is that could you expand on what the scale of agricultural data flow looks like compared to other sectors? And the question for Aisha, I have to find it in the chat.
It's about data protection and
yes, correct, about data protection, yes. And I saw also a question about data Afroculturalism. Someone has the question if you want to share any, data Africanism, and Sylvia would like to hear your thoughts on how we can understand this term. So, okay, maybe Bazo, we can start with you.
Sure. Thanks, Amandine. So the question of the scale of African agricultural data flows, excuse me, compared to other sectors, the answer really is that we don't quite know. And that is for a number of reasons. One of them being that a lot of it is informal it's subsistence based, and it's cross-border across communities that are on different sides of the border. The data that we do have tells us that the African continent is punching below its weight in terms of being an agricultural exporter primarily. And that is for a number of reasons, some of them domestic, as I've alluded to. And again, I think data here can help us, because the way the world is now, in order to play competitively in the agricultural sector, you need data-informed, scientifically informed farming, which is not to say people's way of life should be changed, referring to those subsistence-based farming communities. But in order for us to be more intentional and because Africa should not be food reliant from other regions, it should actually be a net exporter, and yet we're not there yet. And I think it's got to do with data, the lack of precision-based farming. It's got to do with the effects of climate change, ironically, to which Africa has contributed very little, if not nothing. And yet the agricultural patterns are being disrupted because of the changing climate on the African continent, as everywhere else. The other factor behind the continent being really beneath its potential when it comes to agriculture is external factors, including the really protectionist policies of the US and of the European Union. I understand there's farmer protests in Europe at the moment, and a lot of it is to do with the privilege that they've received. And one of the aspects of that privilege is the subsidy which they receive from the Common Agricultural Policy, and in the context of the US, from the US Agricultural Department, Food and Agricultural Department. And this means that the continent, in as much as it could be a net exporter, it's difficult for it to compete with these countries, really. And that's why they end up having access to African markets, because they don't need to be as competitive. They're no longer chasing profit because their governments have already subsidized them. And yet African governments are being forced to not subsidize their own agricultural producers. Then the other dimension here is the different tariffs that are imposed. And here, coffee, I think, is quite telling, because I don't know if it's changed now, but when I last looked maybe a decade ago, but I think I would have found out if it had changed, is the fact that when you, for example, export coffee, the green coffee beans, when you export them to Europe, you get a very low tariff. But when you want to export roasted coffee, which means you would have not have just planted the coffee, you'd also have created jobs through people roasting, beneficiating the coffee. You get, I think, anywhere between 30 to 60% of an ad valorem tariff. And so that tells you to not create jobs on the African continent in the agricultural sector, because that's reserved for Europe and for the US in the global scheme of things. So I think, yeah, I want to highlight just those factors, domestic as well as external, but at the heart of it also then data and economic planning. The ability to enable economic planning is rather limited when you don't have data and when you don't have power. And as we've seen today, the two are often very, very intertwined. Thanks.
Thank you, Baso. Aisha?
Yes. Let me just quickly repeat the question for everyone. Oh, yes. So the question was, how do you find data protection regulations such as GDPR addressing the idea of data colonialism, especially considering a migrant population? Because I referred to vulnerability and borders and refugees. So this question really makes me think of a lot of things. So I'm going to answer the question, but I'm also going to try to briefly expand on the question of refugees and systems and structures of power that we talked about throughout this session. So the first one is, I think GDPR has a very strong emphasis on consent. And what feminist philosophy, but also in general political philosophy, has taught us is that consent is always happening in the context of power. Power is rarely absent from the question of consent. So the question is, who has the power to give meaningful consent? And I think we might all experience that when we asked whether to accept cookies when accessing a website, but that has arguably more grave consequences when the question is whether one receives humanitarian aid. So the consent is given to collect biometric data in order to receive humanitarian aid in context of migration and refugee context. So I think there it becomes very clear that the question of consent and the mechanism of consent in the context of data protection has its limits, so to say. Not to say that I have a perfect alternative to it, but I think we need to be aware of its limits. A second point then is also linked to vulnerability, but in a different way. And here I just want to take up some points that Joshua mentioned on labor and digital labor, and that, for example, a lot of cheap labor, in quotation marks, is data labeling and annotation that is done in refugee camps. So there is really an issue of, again, the question of who's vulnerable, not by giving out data, but by having to accept minimum pay because there is no other work, which is then exploited as an opportunity by companies. And the third point that it made me think of this question with regards to borders and vulnerability and data colonialism is the fact that the border, and specifically also in Europe, the border is not just the physical space of the border of entering a country, but the border really follows refugees and migrants when no longer being in the border space, so to say. So the border space becomes permanent. And what I mean with that is that there is research on surveillance mechanisms, like, for example, anchor bracelets that are normally used in the context of the criminal system or the criminal justice system, that are then used in the context of migration and that effectively lead to criminalization of migration and refugees by means of technology. So there is really a racialized surveillance of refugees that is taking hold, and that is taking hold by means of technology. So these are the 3 points that immediately came to mind when thinking about data protection and data colonialism and vulnerability in refugees.
Thank you. Who actually wants to jump in for the question around data Africanism? Joshua. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, let me just briefly also to follow up on what Aisha just said in terms of, these stacked vulnerabilities. I think the opposite would be looking, for example, at the African Charter of Human Rights, an understanding of different ideas of not just rights, but also obligations and collective action, right? So I think then the question is, if we take serious my earlier point also about, the coloniality, the echoes of these hierarchies and the way they impact the present, then would another vision, another way of actually handling data not also include not just, this idea of negative protection, but also of positive obligation, right? When handling data, right? And wouldn't that not also be opening possibilities to create something that I feel is also missing in GDPR, which is recognition of group-based or group experiences, of collective experiences that are also at the basis not just of vulnerabilities, but also of potentials of understanding and even creating data differently. So what Caleb has said earlier in terms of different communities coming together to create such data, right? I believe if we tap into these kind of collective experiential horizons, right? We would be able to arrive at not some essentialist way of, this is like the African way of doing data, but something where different kinds of collective experiences and collective resources can be marshaled. And I would be very, very sure that even the shape of the data that comes out of this, and I'm sure Caleb could speak more of what is already happening in these collaborative projects, then also is very, very different from the kind of atomized, individualized data points that are, where the way they are collected is geared towards harvesting and extracting value. So if we were to reverse this perception, I think we would arrive at very, very different ways of gathering and even also expressing data.
Thank you, Joshua. We still have 5 minutes. I would like just to give you the opportunity to say a last word around very practical way for supporting, European stakeholders now, especially German, but we can also talk about Europe or West more globally, how they can address very concretely this question of data colonialism, because it's one step to understand what this means theoretically or theoretically or in practice, but the question is also concretely. So if you have to give just one or provide one specific recommendation, what would be this recommendation for these European stakeholders? Maybe we can start with Victor.
Yes, thank you. I think for me is that for them to appreciate that we are not all in Europe, but our data goes beyond our borders. And some people, there is that, I think someone had mentioned that, an inequality in the power relations. So even as we are drafting our laws and our policies, to appreciate that they have a bigger impact than our local areas, and to consider the implications of these policies and laws beyond our national borders.
Thank you. Caleb?
Yeah, I just want to say, I think one thing related to how African countries work with, for instance, like the German government, is this idea of resourcing and funding of or supporting different development programs, and shaping the agenda is easily sometimes what leads into creating tools that are then fostering this colonialism, right? So I think there is a point there to say that, to listen to the voices of different constituents, and not say that we think we know, or our German people say that this money is to do this one thing, but to understand that we also have agencies in our own communities, that if we don't want to do work on youth and development, we want to do it in agriculture, then that is a priority and not the other way around. So I think just reversing already existing practices that support or fund some of these processes. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Basil?
Well, I'm going to maybe give a very self-serving answer, but I would say work with universities, because that is an investment in the future, and it also brings a certain level of symmetry where I think universities are in a stronger position than even governments, if you think about the negotiating the information levels that universities have and the incentives there for universities compared to, say, government entities, and in some cases even civil society, because universities are reflections of their communities, and they are also very empowered in terms of their technical know-how, and so I would say in whatever is done, it's important to be aware and to include the academic community. But I would say also, just on a broader point, I think Germany gets off easy, frankly, because it's the one colonial power that has successor colonial powers on the African continent. If you think about the end of World War I and the transfer of territories, and therefore the guilt of colonialism to the new colonial powers. And I was doing a paper actually on this question of Germany and Africa, and you find the interesting traveling pattern of German chancellors. I mean, it's almost as though they are trying to avoid the countries that they colonize. They'll visit a lot of neighboring countries, but it's almost like they're skating around the countries where they have a very uncomfortable legacy. And I would say, therefore, Germany needs to come to grips with its colonial legacy and to really begin to take these African countries seriously. I mean, some of the attempts at reparation are frankly unacceptable when you compare, for example, to what Germany has been willing to do for Israel. So I would say Germany needs to come to grips with its colonial legacy. And then finally, I would say overall, I think there's a case now to be made for engaging with the continent through the African Continental Free Trade Area. We still find the major outside powers trying to nitpick and engage with the individual countries, whereas the continent has made a collective decision that they want to engage with the outside world through the auspices of the AFCFTA and the AU at large. And I think let's stop the divide and conquer and engage with the collective body, which actually has more bargaining power. So thank you very much. I'll end there.
Thank you, Basil. Aisha?
Yes. Maybe as a final word, I would follow Basil's lead and say follow Basil's lead and saying that Germany needs to come to grips with its colonial legacy. But this can also be in general its legacy, but this can also be the departure point of a dialogue. And for that, I just want to briefly come back to data protection, which in Germany has a very specific history and role because of the data collected throughout the Nazi regime, and this being collected of people in order to then persecute them. And to take this, for example, as a starting point to then have an actual dialogue and conversation, which is not about imposing kind of universal but Eurocentric ideas of what is to be protected and how to define what is to be protected, but to take this as a departure point to then engage with in a dialogue, because there are also systems, for example, in Ghana, but also in Nigeria, of encrypting that are not digital when talking about names, for example. There are names given for which day the person was born on, which is then some kind of non-digital, non-algorithmic way of encrypting and sustaining some kind of privacy by calling the person by that name and not by the other first name. So I'm just saying there needs to be a dialogue, a real dialogue, I think, about what could be different approaches to these topics, which are not always, for which Europe, but I think also Germany, not always has the only and best solution.
Thank you. Joshua?
Yes, I can only agree with what colleagues have said. And as somebody who's carrying exactly such a name as just been described, I would say it's important, first of all, for Germany and Europe to remove some of the hamstrings that they continuously mete out through policies. For example, I mean, Basil mentioned the African level, but let's just also look at the regional level, where the EU and Germany is doing harm by trying to break up the collective bargaining agency of regional blocs, and tries to pick out individual countries, pressuring them with specific deals. And this is just one of the many, many ways in which there's a continued pattern of weakening African institutions. And as I said earlier, understanding coloniality also means understanding the trace of this. And there's a post-colonial trace of this in development assistance, so-called, and the harms that it has done through structural adjustment, poverty reduction strategies, and so on, all of which have harmed especially public institutions, institutions of higher learning, the very, very things that now Europe is looking to interface with when it comes to digital questions. So there's a need to understand this history and to step back from the continued diminishing of these structures in policy interactions. And last point, I think, is also important to step back from the epistemic violence that is perpetrated by Europe and Germany, setting the agenda and believing that it is, you know, the universal point by which all African interests should be measured. So if you really want to have a different kind of partnership, be able to create a space where your so-called partners are also able to really set the agenda, especially when it comes to the questions of data and the digital, and you know, prove to us that you mean this by creating spaces in which African agents, state agents, non-state agents, we've heard from some impressive initiatives here, can really set the agenda when it comes to funding, when it comes to questions of what it needs to be analyzed, and certainly also when it comes to policy design.
Thank you. I think now we're gonna just we are at the end of this data talk, so definitely and really a big thanks to all of you, because it was a fantastic data talk. I think that we have a lot to explore. I don't think that is going to be the last opportunity to discuss the topic. So thank you again. Thank you for also the people who actually stay with us. And I would like to wish you a good day or good night, depending on where you are, and take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.